This is Left Voices for Tuesday, April 1st, 2014. I'm Andrea Sears. Tonight,
this will put the U.S. in a position where it really cannot claim leadership on human rights.
A UN report slams the United States human rights record at home and abroad. Late last week, the United Nations Human Rights Commission issued a report condemning U.S. failure to comply with many aspects of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Domestically, the report pointed to excessive force and racial disparities in law enforcement, the widespread use of solitary confinement, the continuing imposition of life without parole for juvenile offenders, mandatory detention of immigrants, and felony disenfranchisement. On the international front, the report criticizes the failure to hold accountable those responsible for torture, including those with command responsibility, the lack of transparency in planning and execution of the targeted killing program, the 2012 close of investigations into the CIA's rendition to torture program, the failure to close Guantanamo, and the massive NSA surveillance program based on secret legal opinions. The Bush administration had taken the position that the treaty did not apply to actions of the United States outside of its territorial borders. This is the first evaluation of U.S. compliance since President Obama took office in 2009, and although there were early indications that the Obama administration would acknowledge that the covenant applies to foreign as well as domestic actions, at hearings in Geneva last month, U.S. officials once again embraced the Bush administration's interpretation.
This is an unfortunate statement by the U.S. government and by the Obama administration.
Jamil Dakwar is director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Human Rights Program.
This is a position that will continue to make the U.S. an outlier in the world. It will leave a gap in accountability for human rights, especially with relation to overseas operations, whether it's counterterrorism operations or other operations such as, for example, drug enforcement operations in Latin America. And that is going to be a subject for additional criticism from the international community and left to diplomatic processes. The Human Rights Committee was very clear in its criticism of the United States view that the negotiating history, the state practice, and even the view of the International Court of Justice from the past decade clearly state that the ICCPR should apply overseas, certainly to those actions that are of the United States government. And it's unfortunate. There was an attempt by the former legal advisor of the State Department, Harold Koh, to change the position of the United States when he was in office. This was reported by the New York Times, and apparently his view was rejected. And it leaves, really, as I said earlier, the United States as an outlier in the world with regard to human rights and accountability overseas.
What about U.S. allies that have been complicit in some of the activities, especially Great Britain? And I understand that the lead person on this committee compiling this report is British. Does the UK, do Germany, do other countries share the U.S. view?
They don't. The position of the European allies, European countries, is that international human rights do apply overseas, particularly to their operations overseas. And in fact, the European countries are subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights under the European Convention on Human Rights, which is something that the United States does not have any legal obligations under that particular convention and court. And as stated in a number of cases, and even by statements made by those governments, they do not share the view of the United States that governments should not have any obligations of human rights obligations overseas, particularly under the Civil and Political Rights Treaty. Now, this obviously will be again examined. The United Kingdom will be reviewed by the same committee in a few months in Geneva, the Human Rights Committee, and will be also asked questions about their obligations, particularly with relation to their surveillance programs and the impact on non-UK citizens abroad. And so this issue will come back before the Human Rights Committee. But if you take the issue of accountability for past abuses, the UK, even though they have been also complicit in some human rights violations that took place after 9/11, they took more action in at least addressing these violations by non-judicial remedies. They provided some relief to people who were tortured and abused, particularly in U.S. custody, and the U.K. was also complicit in that by failure to act and protect those individuals, as well as the United Kingdom's failures or human rights violations in their operations in Iraq and elsewhere. So being subject to the European Court of Human Rights put them at the higher accountability level than the United States, where the United States continues to reject, for example, the Regional Human Rights Court, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, because the United States has not ratified the American Convention on Human Rights. And it's only subject to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which reviews cases, make decisions, but its decisions are not legally binding.
The report of the ICCPR focuses also on several domestic issues that, according to the administration, do fall under the purview of the committee. Juvenile incarceration, life without parole, the imposition of the death penalty, gun control laws. Is there any response to these concerns that is forthcoming from the administration?
The administration submitted a long report in 2011, and they submitted also responses to initial questions by the committee last year. They also provided additional responses during the review earlier in March, in the middle of March 13 and 14. The responses were also lacking. In certain areas, for example, in the area of voting rights, where the committee was very critical in raising concerns regarding, for example, felony disenfranchisement laws or other violations of the right to vote, the administration did make a strong case that based on the recent statements by the Attorney General, that the federal government will continue to take measures in order to protect the right to vote. On the other hand, in other areas, the U.S. still has not provided full responses and certainly did not make a serious effort to meet its human rights obligations. If you take the issue of solitary confinement, where the U.S. is also an outlier, particularly if you compare it to other democratic nations, you have 80,000 people on any day subject to solitary confinement, including juveniles, including people with mental disabilities. It's practiced in the immigration detention system. The committee was very clear that these practices, solitary confinement, should be strictly used, subject to oversight, and it should not be used at no circumstances against juveniles, against people under the age of 18, and against people with mental disabilities. I believe this is the first time that the committee reaches such conclusions with regard to solitary confinement, and I think they adopted essentially what the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has made with regard to the U.S., but also more internationally in terms of looking at this practice. And as you said, there are other issues where the U.S. did not provide any sufficient answers. For example, in the area of juvenile life without parole, the U.S. remains the only country in the world that sentences juvenile to life without parole. Notwithstanding the recent decisions of the Supreme Court in Graham versus Florida and Miller versus Alabama, we still see that some jurisdictions continue to sentence juveniles to life without parole. This is an issue that was raised by the committee. The U.S. certainly has more to do in order to comply with its obligations. And I believe that this is a review that gives the administration an opportunity to look back at its record, to look at areas within the preview of the executive branch where the president can take actions. If you look at the deportations, where nearly 2 million people were deported under the Obama administration, the president can take steps to curb the deportations. The ACLU made recommendations to the president. On the issue of racial profiling, similarly, we think that the lack of clear guidance by the Attorney General, by the Justice Department on the use of national security as loopholes to conduct racial profiling and spying on communities, particularly Muslim communities in the United States, is something where the Obama administration should do more in order to bring the U.S. in compliance with its human rights obligations.
Well, as you said, the findings of this report are not legally binding. There is no enforcement provision for correction from outside the United States. What is the value of this report, especially considering the U.S.'s longstanding tendency to ignore even international court findings that it disagrees with?
First of all, it's important for the sake of documenting the U.S. record that is out of step with human rights obligations. It's important for increasing international pressure on the United States. Diplomatic pressure is not something that should be completely ignored. While it's not transparent, it's not something that we are aware of, But certainly in the areas, for example, of death penalty, the United States is getting a lot of pressure from the rest of the world, particularly from close allies in Europe. And I believe that similarly, there are some additional pressures will be put on the U.S. on the treatment of migrants, certainly on the issue of criminal justice practices, voting rights, where the OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation of Europe, in its observation mission on the last election, had also a scathing report. This will put the U.S. in a position where it really cannot claim leadership on human rights. It takes away an important moral position that the United States usually is claiming in the world, where they're calling on other governments to abide by the international obligations. Certainly in crises like the one in Ukraine, where the U.S. repeatedly used international law to hold Russia accountable. So I think it only will be better for the United States to fulfill its human rights obligations. Certainly there will not be enforcement mechanisms, but I think over time, the domestic pressure, the domestic accountability with the increasing intolerance to U.S. exceptionalism will certainly make a difference. And I think history only shows that the United States could not completely ignore the rest of the world.
Jamil Dakwar is director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Human Rights Program. This has been Left Voices for Tuesday, April 1st, 2014. You can help support this experiment in independent journalism by visiting our website at www.leftvoices.net and following the Ways to Support Left Voices link at the top of the page. Join us again tomorrow for more news and information from a progressive perspective. I'm Andrea Sears for leftvoices.net.